thinking about that, what that means. 29 weeks, I've been doing, it seems like a long time, but for me at least it's flown by. Hopefully it has not dragged interminably for anyone else. But before we jump into that, before we read it and then start talking about it, we'll pause briefly, we'll have a word of prayer, and then we will read it and discuss it. So if you would pray with me, please. Father in heaven, we thank you for this day. Father, we are grateful for the world that you have made. We are grateful for the lives that we lead. We are grateful for the existence that we have, and we know that the existence that we have is sustained and kept through you. We are grateful, Father, for what you have done for us and continue to do, the blessings you bestow, the gifts you give. We ask that you would be with us now as we study from your word, that we may better understand it and understand how we can live lives that are in accordance with your word and with your will. We are grateful, Father, for all the things you have done, but mostly, and most of all, we are thankful for your Son, Jesus, for his sacrifice, and for the redemption that he brings to us. We pray these things in Jesus' name. All right, so Psalm 29, a psalm of David. Ascribe unto Yahweh, O sons of the mighty. Ascribe unto Yahweh glory and strength. Ascribe unto Yahweh the glory due to his name. Worship Yahweh in holy array. The voice of Yahweh is upon the waters. The God of glory thunders, even Yahweh upon many waters. The voice of Yahweh is powerful. The voice of Yahweh is full of majesty. The voice of Yahweh breaks the cedars. Yea, Yahweh breaks in pieces the cedars of Lebanon. He makes them also to skip like a calf, Lebanon and Sirion like a young wild ox. The voice of Yahweh cleaves the flames of fire. The voice of Yahweh shakes the wilderness. Yahweh shakes the wilderness of Kadesh. The voice of Yahweh makes the hinds to calve and strips the forests bare. And in his temple everything says, glory. Yahweh sat as king at the flood. Yea, Yahweh sits as king forever. Yahweh will give strength unto his people. Yahweh will bless his people with peace. So, my customary first. Okay, who God is, who Yahweh is, yes. Is this, what mode of psalm is this? What is the form? We've been dealing with mostly a lament form of psalm in the last 3 or 4 psalms that we've read and talked about. Is this the same, or is this a shift to something else? Praise. Yeah, this is more of a psalm of praise rather than of any sort of lament. There is no enemy that really appears. No one that is persecuting either the psalmist or the people of God. There is no real request of God in this psalm, merely a description of attributes or a description of actions, rather than any sort of pleading that is going on. It's not really a psalm that's intended, though there's not a lot of these in psalms, that some people may classify as a wisdom psalm or a teaching kind of psalm so much, but really one more straightforwardly, indeed, of praise. Some Greek manuscripts at the very beginning, to the title where it says of David, add the extra addition, at the leaving of the tabernacle. Why would that be added in some manuscripts? And does that change or affect in any way the way that we would understand this psalm? Yes, ma'am.
Like he must have really been lifted up when he was in the tabernacle. Maybe still leaving.
Okay. Yeah, it does kind of give you an indication of how one feels as they're leaving the place of worship, right? This is the almost sense of exultation with the U that one has after an experience with God.
I know to say it was a voice in the storm. I don't see anything in here that's storm-like.
We will, in fact, we will get to that. You're anticipating a little, but you're right, yes. Speaking of the voice out of the storm, we'll talk about why that is. But yes, sir, in the back, you were...
Yeah, it's in the Greek
Yeah, and indeed, the titles themselves, I don't know that we should really consider part of the scripture itself, more as an explanation, particularly because so many of them have things that we do not understand in the titles. Frequently, they appear to be references to musical notation, the tune to which is to be played, instructions for various uses of the psalm itself, rather than the contents of the psalm speaking in any sort of prophetic or authoritative way about God and who he is and who we are in relationship to him. And so that kind of note could easily be one that is added later merely as a way of indicating that this is, one might think of it as a psalm of benediction. That is to say, a psalm for closing services, for going out, and that it is suited to that purpose. Indeed, as was pointed out, because this is the point at which you should arrive during or maybe after a worship of God in the tabernacle, in the temple, as the temple is built later. But that you go, worship takes place, petitions are brought, sacrifices are made, and then praise and confidence in who God is and what he does as you leave. So it's merely, again, I would say just sort of a direction to when it would be suitable as a suggestion to someone who might select which psalms are going to be used at a particular time. The phrase at the beginning, and this is going to start getting into that question of the idea of the storm. Sons of the mighty is an unusual phrase here at the beginning of this psalm. The NIV has O mighty ones. The exact wording is argued over. As you can see in my note, the Syriac translation actually changed it to young rams rather than indicating sons of the mighty. The Greek texts, some of them, will add an additional line as a way of trying to further translate and clarify what the translator believed the intent of that line to be, that the rams are offerings to God in that first verse, ascribing to the Lord, O mighty ones. They changed that around and put another line in. I don't know that that's necessary. Several of the commentaries I read talked about how that's understandable, that someone would try and do that in translation to try and, again, clarify what is perceived to be the intent. I'm going to back up a couple slides to show an example of there's two words as italics here in verse 10. Some Bibles do this, some do not. Those do not literally actually appear in the text as king. The line is, Yahweh sat at the flood, yea, Yahweh sits as king forever. And the way that the lines work together, because they are speaking of the same idea, the as king is implied by the totality of the verse. He sits at the flood, indeed, he sits as king forever, meaning, in the translator's opinion, and I would agree, that it's trying to say he was king when the flood came, and he is king now and forever. But it's inferred. And this is a common thing that translations have to do. Again, depending on the language and exactly what you're translating, not every language has the same forms of words. And so to make it even make grammatical sense in English, sometimes you have to insert things in order to make that work. This way of doing it is maybe a little much, adding a full other line to try and clarify, saying that it is about an offering. I don't think it was needful or necessary, but know that that is the reason that in some translations you will see those words appear here. And in fact, there will be another place later on in this psalm where the reading, especially notable here, it's the NIV, varies from the text in terms of its literal, what it says. So, moving on. The psalm appears to be a form of polemic against false gods, specifically, perhaps, against Baal, who was a storm god of Canaan. There are several reasons for this, and we'll get into this, but this is why I think you probably had that note that talked about it being referring to a storm. The description of what it is that is occurring at the voice of God over the verses from 3 through 9 is a description of what happens during a particularly violent storm. And so this is, led some people to think that this has actually been cribbed, taken, and then just slightly tweaked from a Canaanite hymn in order to make it one about God. I would tend against that view, but you will see if you study this that there is that opinion out there. I think more likely it has been deliberately formed as hopefully this isn't the wrong way to put it, and I've talked about this before, a way of exulting. Again, different from the word exalt. The exult is the kind of celebratory, in-your-face touchdown dance that you do in order to proclaim superiority over another. And this is doing that for God, for Yahweh, over the false gods of the people that lived around Israel. In this case, specifically, probably for the Baal. They used terms that were used by those pagans in order to assert the primacy of Yahweh. So the words here, ascribe to the Lord, O mighty ones, ascribe to the Lord glory and strength, are specific references to the way that other peoples spoke about their gods. And instead, this is asserting the supremacy of Yahweh, the God of Israel. The word strength you'll see rendered, if you go to the Greek, as honor in verse 1, but it is the same Hebrew word that they render as strength in 11. Just a quick linguistic note. Verse 2 then calls for those who worship to be and to appear holy when they do so. Because of who God is, because of his own holiness, his own sanctity, and being set apart from that which is worldly or sinful, when we go to worship the Lord, to do so in a holy array. People will argue, and I don't know that it matters tremendously if you can understand it either way. This is, of course, one of the beauties of poetry, that you can layer the meanings. Whether that is the person arraying themselves properly in sanctification and holiness when they approach God, or to note that God himself is holy and must be approached as such, right? That God is, the NIV puts it, in the splendor of his holiness. But I would say, again, I think that refers to the person. All right, I've rushed a little bit through the first two verses. I'm going to pause here because there's a little bit of a shift as it gets into the next 6, 8 verses, something like that, where we talk about specifically the attributes of God and what occurs. Any comments before I move on? All right. The proximate cause of worship is in verse 3. This is a storm. The psalmist is speaking of praising God, speaking of God's magnificence and power, while witnessing or knowing of a storm that is occurring. Right? The storm that puts awe and fear into the hearts of men, the psalmist speaks of as being under the control and power of God. That God, therefore, is greater than the storm itself. That if you fear the effects of the storm, you should fear all the more the holy God that controls the storm, or has power over it. So we can see in verse 3 that it speaks of the voice of the Lord over the waters. What waters are they referring to? Could be the ocean, I guess. They would not have been familiar, this is probably geographic pedantry, but they wouldn't be familiar with the ocean, of course. They would have thought of it, the great water, as being the Mediterranean. Yeah. Where is Lebanon relative to Israel? I should have brought a map. I didn't even think about this. North. It's north. So this is a description of things that occur to the north. a storm forming over the Mediterranean and passing across the countries to the north of Israel, Lebanon and Syrian, and then there are multiple places called Kadesh, but there's one to the north that is then east of Lebanon. So it begins north of there. It begins in the land of Baal, near the sea. And then it proceeds from there. Canaanite sources refer to Baal and specifically reference 7 peals of his thunder when referring to the things that he does and his actions. Has anyone counted yet how many times the voice of God is mentioned in this psalm? And if you haven't, would you like to guess how many times it's mentioned? 7. There are 7 mentions of the voice of the Lord. Again, this is another sort of bit of kind of contextual evidence that this is written, again, as a polemic against a specific Canaanite god. Baal was their god of the storm and the thunder. It speaks of God being the true controller of the storm and the effects thereof. They speak of Baal and his 7 peals of thunder. It refers to the voice of God affecting things through the storm 7 times. And so this is kind of a way of continuing to reiterate that God is truly the real God, the one who is in control. I should have asked that question, but this is the reason why they write those verses, right? To emphasize the world around them to the others. Yahweh is the ruler of the earth, and thus worship, is kind of referring back to verse 2, of anyone else is not acceptable. And this seems like a pretty obvious point to us sitting in this room, maybe, but it is not so obvious to anyone else, or particularly to people of that time. Why would this have been less apparent to the people outside of Israel then? Yeah, they have a very different worldview by virtue of where they were born, how they were raised, what they lived. The world itself was very different. The world that we inhabit tends to a particular kind of view, particularly in the Western world. If you are religious, what sort of religious category do you usually fall in? Whether you're Jewish or Christian, Muslim, monotheistic. Yeah, exactly. We tend to think of the God as being exclusionary. If you believe in God like this, you can't believe in God like that. That if this God is real, you can't believe any of the other ones have any true reality. But the pagan world was very different. Christianity and its effect on the Western world has so shaped the way that we think about things that it's easy to forget that for most of the history of the world and for most of the rest of the world, particularly Asia, a lot of Africa, multiple gods, polytheism is a dominant way of thinking. And it was indeed in Canaan and the lands surrounding Israel at this time. They would think of Yahweh as a god. The pagans that worship Baal or the Ashereths or any of the other false gods around would accept that Yahweh was a god. They merely thought of him as one among many gods, and there was a strong bias as well to geography defining which god to worship. Yahweh is the God of Israel, the people that live in this place and follow him, but in other places, other gods hold sway. Now, that doesn't just mean that that is who the people follow or who the people believe in, but that those gods are in geographic locations and thus should be worshipped should you go to that place. And the revolutionary idea that is introduced with Judaism and carried on through Christianity is, in fact, no, polytheism is not the true way of looking at the world, that there is but one true and eternal God, and he is God of all the earth and deserves worship wherever you are in the same ways. There's not one way for people in one place, another way for people in another place, one way at one time for it. God is God, and he is eternal and unchanging, and God of, indeed, all the universe, not merely all the world. It is a revolutionary kind of idea, and this psalm talks about this by making God the cause, the author, the controller of what occurs even outside of Israel's borders. Even this storm that is nowhere in Israel, not in the land that the pagans would have thought of as being the domain of Yahweh, the psalmist says, no, God is still in control of what happens outside of what you may think of as his domain. 5 emphasizes the action of God by repeating what is done, breaking the cedars. It speaks of this twice. Why cedars? Did I put that in the next? No, that's not yet. Why cedars? There are other ones that are probably stronger in terms, but they are large, they are strong, they are useful for many different purposes. Construction, they're pleasant too. A lot of people find their aroma very nice, especially when you shape them into buildings or furniture. But there's a further reason.
They resist deterioration.
They do, yeah. They're good for preventing, pests and so forth, I believe. It is the symbol of the nation or the area of Lebanon. I believe if you look up the flag of Lebanon today, it has a cedar on it. It has long been associated as the symbol of that place. And by putting that in here as being broken and destroyed by the power of God, it emphasizes that the other nations are subject to the power of Yahweh. That they are subject to him and what he wishes done. His will rules even other places. And the symbol of the country can be broken by the power of God. It is his voice speaking through the storm. The symbolism in the next verse, in 6, skipping like a calf or a wild ox. What is this intended to convey? This is a poetic rendering of something happening. But what? An earthquake. Yeah, the two references here, Lebanon and Sirion, seem to refer to mountains. Making the mountains themselves, if you've ever seen a young calf or a young animal, a foal or a colt playing, jumping around, it moves a lot. They get up and get down. Cows can jump surprisingly high. I don't know that we can really, like the nursery rhyme says, jumping over the moon, but they jump. And so this is intended to, again, convey God merely speaking into the world causes these great upheavals. His power is over the trees, his power is over the waters, his power is over the land. It is a reiteration, an emphasizing of the power of God as we go through. In 6, the them, so this is, it depends on, let me make sure I have the translation I was reading from the first time. He makes them also to skip like a calf, Lebanon and Sirion like a young wild ox. The them is a suffix indicating that it is encompassing both lines in this. Makes them also, and then the subject is given in the second line, Lebanon and Sirion. So it is for both of them to skip and to jump about. The NIV spoils this, which annoyed me because I was going to make this into a question. Speaking of, in the ASV, the much more poetic and more literal, cleaves the flames of fire, which is another indication of the storm. This is, again, a poetic and descriptive way of speaking of lightning. The lightning is split and forked without a real knowledge, and I was a liberal arts guy, so don't look to me for scientific things, but without getting into exactly what lightning and electricity is, To understand that as fire is I think, a clearly easy thing to do, particularly for, again, an ancient culture who sees what happens. The lightning strikes, the fire starts, so that God is also in that as well, that he has a voice that brings fire down from above. Yes, sir?
You're talking about
Verse
verse 7.
7, yes. Did I say 6? I beg your pardon.
The image that I got was God holding an axe, chopping away the fire, and I thought that's a little odd, but that's primarily one of the ways firefighters put out fires.
Sure. Yeah. A firefighter would remove the fuel by chopping it away or cutting it down, but I think in this case it refers to the forked nature of lightning, probably. Yeah. Does anybody remember the story of? Oh, yes, sir.
Yeah, the literal, I'm following along in the literal
Oh,
Hebrew here. And the literal in the Hebrew is the voice of Yahweh divides the flames of fire.
Yep. Yeah.
That's it.
To cleave or divide the fire. Yeah.
I think a lot of translations take a lot of poetic license. You have to be very careful which one you're reading, correct?
Yeah, and that's of course the beauty and the difficulty with this is that we understand a lot of the Bible in a literal way, and it is important to defend the literal nature of a lot of the text against people who would argue that it cannot be thus, right? The virgin birth, the resurrection of Christ, the miracles that we see performed, right? People will try to tell you that those cannot be understood literally, that they are supernatural and that that's not possible. And sometimes it's easy to fall into such a defensive mode of saying, no, it must be literally so, that when we get into books like the Psalms that are explicitly designed to be poetic, they're supposed to be beautiful and to render things with similes and metaphor and various ideas, that we can lose track when we're looking at a particular translation of thinking, well, it must literally say lightning. It must literally say this word. Whereas the translator knows that it is a poetic simile or metaphor and is trying to render it comprehensible. And we can end up getting tripped up in all kinds of various ways. The detailed kind of textual study of books like Psalms really do repay the effort that you put in, because there is a lot of interesting things there. And the ways that people argue over what is the proper way to understand this idea, even if we don't necessarily come to the same conclusion, we both benefit from hearing the opinion of the other person about, well, what does he mean by that? When he says, the psalmist says that God cleaves or divides the flame, maybe he means something else. I don't have to be dogmatic about it. The deeper and more important meaning to not lose sight of course, is the psalm is about the power of God and the extent of his power over all the earth. And these are all various ways of expressing that, and we can argue about the details of what that one line might mean, but we both, I think, all of us, both of us if there were two in conversation, agree that that's the general meaning of the psalm that the psalmist is trying to convey.
Poetry can use many, many different words and images to get things across. People probably would understand better if you try to treat it scientifically. You have to have a specific term, and they're going to have to understand that term, and it's not generally poetic.
Sure. Yeah, and again, you do things for a song that you wouldn't necessarily do in writing a scholarly paper. You want it to be pleasing to the ear. And the way that Hebrew was understood to be pleasing to the ear is not the way that we understand English to be pleasing to the ear. We've talked about this in several different classes. They didn't like rhyme like we do. They preferred things like alliteration and repeating an idea forwards and then backwards again through the second line. Things like that are much more foreign to our idea of poetry, and then can also get lost in the translation, because the words that alliterate all start with the same letter for them. They don't all start with the same letter for us. So we lose that element of what's there sometimes. Elijah and the priests of Baal. Does anybody remember this story from 1 Kings 18? Ahab the king, Elijah confronts him. There's been the drought on the land for 3 years. And they go up on top of the mountain. And each of the two, the priests of Baal and Elijah, set up altars with a sacrifice on top. And then what do they ask for? They ask for the God that they serve to start the fire for the offering. And why would they ask Baal? Baal is the storm god. They would expect him to be able to send down fire from heaven, strike it with lightning, to control the rain. And the whole point of Elijah doing this in front of them, in front of the king, is to demonstrate that Baal is not in control of these things. The drought is not because they have not served Baal. The drought is because they have not served God. That God is the one who is manifestly in control. It is a lot of resonance with this particular psalm and the actions that go on in that story. I mentioned this a minute ago. Kadesh and 8 is probably in the north. Most of the time when you see Kadesh mentioned, it's actually in the southern part of Israel. But it's a place that means like a holy place or a set-apart place. So there's a lot of Kadeshes that are around. 9 wraps up the effects of the storm, shaking the desert of Kadesh. And then twisting. The NIV has twists the oaks and strips the forest bare. But a lot of other translations, in a more literal rendering, the voice of Yahweh makes the hinds, or deer, to calve and strips the forest bare. Why the discrepancy? It's an attempt to harmonize with the next line. So frequently, as we've talked about, the way that the verses work in a lot of Psalms is that they will have a line that will repeat an idea or refer to the same idea in a different way. And so with the forest being stripped bare, the idea that it would twist the oak and strip the forest bare provides the idea of the trees being affected in both line 1 and line 2. But there are some difficulties with this. There's a third line in this verse, and it is completely different from speaking of trees and forests entirely. And in his temple all cry, glory. So it already shifts partway through. So the other reason is, and I used some pictures because Hebrew is not my strong suit, but I had a chance to do this. It is easy to confuse these things. So I am told, because I do not read Hebrew, but I'm confident in my authority, this is the word hinds, or female deer. And this is the comparison, oak trees. So there's a few marks under the first letter, the first one being on the right, of course, in Hebrew, because they go right to left, and with the second letter. And other than that, it's the same. Now, as well, those diacritical or other marks are supposed to indicate the vowels that go with the consonants, Hebrew being a consonantal kind of language, the vowel sounds that go with it, which is why Yahweh is such a strange word or a way of putting it. It's all essentially consonants because they never put those vowel points in until much later to try and explain how to pronounce it. So when you go back to the very, very original Hebrew, it would not have had those explanatory marks, which is why translation is so difficult sometimes. Oak trees does seem to work in some sense. It fits with things, but taking the other words of that line, it seems that the former is probably the better, the more accurate translation, even if it is maybe a little bit more difficult to comprehend. But this is the sort of challenge that translators put up with to help out folks like us who do not speak or read the original languages. So, just as a way of example there. The flood in verse 10 is the specific word only ever used for the Genesis flood. So this appears to speak specifically of the Great Deluge. Why would they make reference to that after speaking of a storm for most of the psalm? Why shift to another event far back in history? Storms do cause floods, but not necessarily floods that destroy the world. And certainly he has been speaking of a storm of that magnitude, one that has not affected Israel but has passed through the lands north of Israel. It is a reference to power, yeah. It speaks of a compare and contrast. That by talking about two ends of a spectrum, it speaks of God's power and control over the whole, right? God, one of the terms for him is both what? The Alpha and the Omega, right? The beginning and the end. God encompasses everything. God encompasses the small local storm. God was king over the greatest flood that will ever be. God is king in the small things. God is king in the great things. It draws the contrast between the two ends of the spectrum in order to show God's authority, God's power, God's majesty over all, one end and the other. And then finally, to conclude, the power of God is used for the benefit of his people. The Lord gives strength to his people. The Lord blesses his people with peace. That God is not just great. God is not just powerful. God is not just sovereign over the universe, but also by his nature he is loving. He blesses his people. He gives them peace. There are things that he does for us and we can depend on because he is both so great and so loving. It concludes with relating these things back to the people that are singing his praises. Look at that, 11 verses. I finished with 3 minutes to go. Plenty of time. Comments, questions, and even, in fact, though I normally try not to leave time for it, complaints if you wish to register them. Now is your big moment. This probably won't happen again for weeks and weeks. Anyone? Anything? I don't know that I could count the time. I don't know, this is probably not interesting to most people. I don't spend a lot of time where I say, all right, I'm going to spend an hour now, I'm going to spend a half hour now. I spend a lot of time reading it, and then I'll think about it, read some commentaries, and then I have 4 children, but only 3 of them are at home. Then I usually get called away to go do something, and then I have to come back to it. So it's not ever it's not 3 hours at a go, certainly. I'm happy if I can get 45 minutes, but I spread them out over several weeks. Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
In the last couple of years, I've been hearing an English Standard Version. And surprisingly, I get totally lost because it's so different. I have not had that experience before, but he's got New American Standard, and in the first verse, I have heavenly beings instead of Sons of the Mighty. So it's just, I really noticed the difference in the songs.
Yeah, and maybe this is a good segue. The translations are really not, most commonly available English translations, I mean, take for what it's worth coming from me, who's not a Hebrew or a Greek scholar, are probably fine for most purposes, right? The real advantage for study comes in having access to multiple translations, right? And being willing to go back and really look at difficult things using like a Strong's Concordance or something in Greek and in Hebrew and think about, okay, well, where else is this word used so that you can better understand it? But for, your daily Bible reading, most of them are fine. I mean, I'm not a fan of, the Message translation. There's some other ones out there, but, NIV. I really like the Old American Standard just because I really like the poetic language that is very reminiscent of Shakespeare. That's just me in a kind of aesthetic preference. My actual Bible that's got all my notes and helps and things is actually NIV because that's what I was given when I graduated from high school. So. Yeah, I do like that joke, right? If the King James was good enough for Paul, it's good enough for me, but yeah. Any other comments, questions? Yes, sir, yeah.
Yeah, it's like what I was referencing before, that, if you look at, I like to use Bible Hub, and the reason for that is I can look at different translations, and I can also look at, reading the New Testament, I can look at the Greek, or if I'm reading the Old Testament, I can look at the Hebrew to see what the actual Hebrew is, so that it helps me to better understand what the translator is trying to help me understand in the English version. When you look at the New American Standard, if you even look at the description of the New American Standard, what their goal, what their objective is to stay as true to the original language as they can, while still making it understandable in English. With that in mind, when I look at what the translators of the New American Standard say, and what the Hebrew is, it's almost word for word where they can make it such. So if we understand, God dividing the fire, which is the literal thing. Try to divide fire. Run your hand through fire, try to divide it. You can't do it. Try to divide water with your hand, you can't do it. But the voice of God can divide the waters. The voice of God can divide fire. Again, speaking to your broader point of the power of God. God has power that we do not have.
Oh, indeed, yeah.
And we're celebrating that in this song, the greatness of God, what he can do that we cannot do.
Yeah.
So I agree with you entirely.
Yeah, exactly. The psalm itself is about God's power and its superiority to the power of any of the foreign gods. One probably specifically was targeted with this, but generally to anyone and anything else. Yeah. All right. Well, I have successfully used up my last couple minutes. Thank you all very much for your patience and your time, and we'll talk about Psalm 30 next week.